What's up, everybody? I know I have been a little MIA on the internet on these updates. I've been doing the first couple weeks of the On Deck cohort, On Deck Health cohort, and that has been really great. I expect to write a little post about the first maybe couple weeks about that, maybe next week or the week after. Just some lessons and some things that I've learned. It's been going really well so far. I've met a lot of really great people, have gotten some great feedback and input, and some great resources. So I'm excited to continue that. But this week and for this video, I want to go ahead and break down a couple things. So in the past couple weeks, while I've been doing that, I've been experimenting with a few things in terms of migrating the app or the prototype to View 3 versus View 2 to get advantage of some newer modules and kind of components that have come out for Tailwind. Decided ultimately not to do that because it just felt like a huge amount of rework that just wasn't necessary. So I've been spent a lot of time kind of cleaning up some of the back end, making sure things work a little bit better before I kind of keep going further. But today what I want to do, and actually about a week and a half before On Decks kicked off on the 12th, I actually did a round of user testing on this prototype with 3 clinicians that I'm working with. And I have 4 lessons that I want to kind of break down here, both about how to do clinical user testing and some of the things that I learned, particularly about Alloy or Healthcare OS, that I'm going to be implementing moving forward. So I'm really excited to share those with you, and I've got 4 of them, so I'll do my best to get through them quickly. And yeah, so we'll just jump in the first one. So the first one is language. So language, especially in the context of an app, kind of encapsulates 2 main things. One is microcopy, so that's copy that essentially informs the interface. So microcopy is copy that helps a user perform an action, indicates what they're supposed to do, where they're supposed to go, what things there are to do. The most popular and the most easy, or the easiest to understand form of microcopy would be a button or a link. So a button says, add to cart. Well, that's microcopy about that action. And so that kind of microcopy is really important, and specifically microcopy in terms of healthcare is really important because as should be obvious and as is obvious, what is obvious to me or what makes sense to me doesn't necessarily make sense to a clinician. And so a lot of this has just been testing even microcopy and saying like, okay, what button language makes sense for different actions? So in here, when you have begin versus view chart versus reschedule, do those buttons, does that text make sense? View chart, if for those of you who are like more eagle-eyed among us, you probably will recognize that this actually used to say review. And I had a clinician who goes, well, review doesn't really make sense because I'm just viewing the chart. And I had gotten that review language from another clinician in a couple, maybe a year ago, who had said like, the flow is before I go in, I review my chart. And so review chart made sense. Or review made sense, but that review was too short. It was a little bit too short. It was a little bit too vague to be useful. And so view chart just became a little bit more helpful, because even though the action or the context is that they're reviewing the chart information before they go with the patient, viewing the chart is still kind of what you're doing. It makes more sense. So so things like that have come up a lot, and that's been really great because that's the kind of thing that I really don't know by myself. And so being able to kind of work with a clinician to say, okay, that doesn't make sense to you, so what would make sense, and let's work through that together. That's been a great thing. The second kind of example here of copy or language in an interface that is important is kind of essentially the placeholder text in here that I've entered, that is in lieu of a user entering text. I'm sure there's a name for this. I'm not entirely sure what it is, if there is, but basically it's stuff like this fever for 3 days, complains of headache, fatigue, and muscle ache. So that chief complaint would be something that maybe a nurse, an intake nurse, maybe someone in the front desk staff, maybe a MA, maybe a PA would enter. Maybe in some cases the clinician themselves might enter it. They would enter that, and then a physician user, who this screen specifically right here is for, they would come in and they would see that. And so that sentence right there actually used to be a little bit more wordy. And I had a clinician who went, hey, yeah, we wouldn't use that many words. We would say, I think it said patient was running fever or something like that. And he said, no, 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 fever for 3 days, complains of headache, fatigue, and muscle ache. So that in of itself is enough context or enough information for that. Now, the challenge with that, and the challenge as with all interfaces that have user editable content, is that that best case scenario may or may not happen every time. In fact, I talked to another clinician who said sometimes the stuff that gets put in as a chief complaint isn't actually even accurate to what the appointment is for and why someone is there. And so you actually have this really big disconnect when it comes down to it. And so that is something that we'll have to continue to refine. But even still, when it comes to testing this introductory kind of prototype, that's still something that's very important to work through, is making sure that the context or the content is accurate, that it is the right language, whereas you and I, where a layperson may use certain terms, a clinician is going to use different terms. And so making sure those terms are correct. Thankfully, our users that are testing are really, really gracious about that and really helpful in terms of reworking content and making sure that the right language is in there, and they're very patient with that. So that's great, and that's really what we're looking for in terms of those user testers. But those are the two things in terms of lesson one. So language matters. Your microcopy is important, and the language that you're using in terms of clinical terminology and kind of best case scenario, or at least average case scenario copy is really important. The second thing here that I've learned is that the system makes the details. And this probably is going to sound really counterintuitive compared to lesson one. And there's a very good chance that 6 months from now, I might come back to this and say, this is an awful lesson. But I think the system makes the details is really important for this stage, because what we're trying to do here is not necessarily nail every single possible interaction or every single possible potential kind of extraneous use case, because the reality is that in order to do that, we would have to spend insane amounts of time to nail something that really does hit that. What we're trying to do here is to create a system that can handle the details no matter what we throw at it. Now, on the surface, that sounds really good, and I think it's a really important lesson, but it does come with a caution, or a caution from me mostly, is that while the system should make the details and that the system is most important here, that does need to make that we do have to ensure that our details are accurate, that the information is accurate, that the use cases that we're throwing in here, all these patients are covering a pretty good gamut of different scenarios that a clinician is going to encounter. That way we can essentially stress test the way someone works through this, and not necessarily stress test the very specific pieces of information that someone may or may not want to have in here. So as an example for that, if we click on Priscilla and she has primary hypertension, diabetes, she had her last appointment, most clinicians, especially in primary care, they're going to have a certain series of next steps they're going to take. And so these modules that they may want to add could be last appointment, could be, their active condition, might be the medication list. All those things might be additional modules they want to add in here. However, we can't necessarily predict that for every single possible scenario. And so my goal with this, or my intention here, is that we are able to kind of feel out these specific scenarios so that we can kind of fake the system. So instead of necessarily having to have every single possible module laid out for Priscilla, we've laid out the ones that are most likely to be used. In addition, we want to be able to have machine learning that learns over time based on these variables. A clinician uses these modules, and so we can kind of suggest those things. Well, we're not going to be able to build that machine learning algorithm right now, and so the important thing is to understand the context so that we can kind of fake it and test. Do these module ideas work? Does the flow from spaces into modules into additional spaces even work? And when they do, can they kind of flow through that, and does it make a noticeable difference to a clinician's workflow? And then is it a marketable product? Because at that point, that's what's really important. And, the machine learning, AI, all those things, and the specific CPT codes and dictation and all this stuff, those things definitely have to be created. But those things, again, we can kind of fake it. And so the system behind, or the system that we're using, the UX system, is the most important thing. And those things we can kind of fake for now. The third lesson here is the fold still applies, kind of. And so if you're not familiar with the fold is basically anything that falls off your desktop or your screen when you first hit a site or a page. That would be called the fold. And so anything that's below the fold is basically out of view, out of your screen or your viewport. Now, there's conflicting opinions and content and research out there whether or not it's still important. I think it's still important here for one main reason, is that the fold can dictate what kind of action someone takes. So specifically, I pulled up, or I had all of our users pull up this particular page, this patient note filled page, which this is filled with a section of a SOAP note. And almost every user had a pretty small laptop screen size. I'm using a 27-inch monitor here. Even my laptop is a 16-inch MacBook Pro, so they're pretty big screen sizes. But they were all using fairly small 15-inch size screens. And so I'll kind of show you what that looks like here, where we can kind of do this. So I can pull this up and we can kind of fake it. So this is essentially what they were seeing. Now, what you'll notice is that a lot of this content is falling off the page, but even specifically this little kind of menu is falling off the page in a pretty far off and pretty far down there, to the point where they would hit this page and they'd be like, I don't really know what to do. I'm not really sure. And I would kind of have to prompt them. And so this is partially a fold problem. This is partially a responsive problem because, on a smaller screen size, we can make this text wider and things would come up the page more. All of this area with these blocks would be able to be wider. So there are some responsive issues there as well. But my main thing here is that, particularly on this page, even if you were to hit I think it was the appointment page. Yeah, so even here on the appointment page, we were still running into some issues. I fixed a lot of them now, but we were running into some issues where some of these blocks were so big that they were pushing other pages or some of these buttons off the bottom of the screen. And so that was really a problem that actually made it so that they weren't really sure what to do. So that's something that I have to continue to work through, something I need to keep in mind, but still something that's really important. I think that it is valuable and worth noting if you're going to be doing something like this. And then the fourth thing here, and this is a really important, this kind of goes back even to lesson 2, but it's still really important regardless of any type of user testing, but I think specifically for clinical user testing, it's equally important, is there are so many different users, there are so many different potential things that someone is doing, either workflows or contexts or tasks or whatever that might be. There's so many of these different things that they have to do on a daily basis, any number of users, that setting the context is really, really important. I always try to say when especially in the first time through, when we would look at this, I would say, okay, imagine you're coming in at the beginning of the day, it's Tuesday or it's Monday or whatever, and you can see the time, imagine it's the first thing you do in the day and this is the screen you see, and tell me your reaction to that and tell me what else you might want to see here. And that kind of information, that kind of context is really important to help set the stage for how someone is going to think about the app. If I just said, okay, here it is, let me know what you think, they're going to go, well, I kind of like it, I think it works pretty well, but they're not in the right mindset, or they're not within the right context to understand, because there's a good chance that if they were to see this and they say, yeah, it's great, I love it, then if you built it, shipped it, and they were to pull it up, they would go, oh, this is not what I wanted at all. This doesn't work, because suddenly you're not in the right context. And so setting the context is really important. And I think that goes back to lesson 2 as well, where we're talking about the system, where the system and the context of having individual patients that we've talked about, of their different ages or different genders, they have different problems, they have different, they're coming in for different reasons. Some of them are follow-up, some of them are first time. All of those different contexts can be really helpful for a clinician when they're testing something, when they're going through and they're saying, okay, is this something that's going to work for my day to day? Because that's ultimately where you're trying to get to. User testing is not trying to, pat a designer on the back. It's not trying to say, oh, I love this, it's so good, it's the best thing I've ever seen. That's not what the point is. The point is to say, does this solve the need I have? Does this solve the problem I have? Does this fix a need? Does it address something? And do I foresee myself using it? And that's why when you do user testing, and for me, I often say, okay, tell me what you think you can do. Go ahead and try to do it, and tell me what your reaction is, because I want to know both the gut reaction, and then once you've kind of explored it a little bit, I want you to, again, kind of begin to keep thinking, keep telling me your thought process. And that context is just so important to say, like, it's the first thing in the day, you're getting ready to walk in with a patient, you've just walked in with a patient, or you've just finished with a patient, and now what are you going to do? You walk in to work with a patient, you go in with your notepad, you come out, you're ready to write your note, and this is the screen you see. What do you think? And you start from there, and you begin to get that information from them so that you can begin to compile it in a way that makes sense to make it actionable. I think that is really, really key here. I'm going to be continuing to work through this. I've got new designs, and I've got new stuff that we're still building on. So there's a lot to work through here, and I'm excited to continue to work through it. But On Deck may slow things down over the next couple of weeks and months. But thank you for watching. If you have any thoughts, if you have any questions, if you want to get involved, please let me know. You can reach out to me at alloyhealthcare.org, or you can find me on Twitter or LinkedIn, wherever that is. So thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.